There is a Greek myth that talks about a man who was highly intelligent and he was an inventor. This man was hired by a king and he created the very labyrinth in which they put the infamous Minotaur. Well, it was the king that hired this man named Daedalus, who then turned against him and imprisoned him, Daedalus, and his son Icarus in a tower. And so there they were on this island in the Mediterranean with no way to escape. But Daedalus was an inventor, so he found a way to take leather straps and wax and feathers and other materials, and he constructed wings for both he and his son so that they could leap from the tower, sail across the Mediterranean, and find their way back to the mainland. But as they were getting ready and putting their wings on, the father, Daedalus, said to his son, Icarus, you must be careful, because if you fly too low, then all of the moisture and the mist of the sea will cause the feathers to get wet. It will weigh you down, and then you will crash. However, if you fly too high, if you get too close to the sun, then the Mediterranean sun will melt the wax, and then your wings will fall apart, and you will crash down into the Mediterranean, and you will die as your body hits what will feel like concrete at that speed. So they get up on the tower, they get ready, and the father and son, they jump off, and they begin gliding, flying over the Mediterranean. Now, I know what it would be like. I can imagine to have wings and to be able to fly, it would be pretty cool. And so while the father is wise, he's keeping himself not too high, not too low, just trying to get to the mainland. The son wants to experiment, wants to have fun, wants to see what this thing can do. And so the son begins to fly higher and higher against the advice and wisdom of his father. And as his father suggested, the wax began to melt. And there Icarus fell to his death. Now, this is a first century fresco of this very myth. You can see Icarus flying. This is the 17th century, and there he is falling next to his father. This Greek myth became one of the prime lessons when it comes to hubris, when it comes to arrogance, when it comes to the belief that the rules don't apply to me. And Icarus learned his lesson, sadly, in death. And the idea of the myth is that we should learn this lesson in life and not push the boundaries, not attempt to fly too high. Now, you might say, what does this have to do with the story of Jacob in Genesis 29? What we find is that Jacob was an arrogant, prideful man filled with hubris and who didn't seem to believe in boundaries. He thought that he could do whatever he wanted, he could manipulate whoever he wanted to and get away with it and face few consequences. So what we're going to find in this story is the Lord has to continue to chisel away and develop the character of Jacob because he's got some serious problems. So if you have your Bibles, stay with me. We're going to be in Genesis 29. It's already been read. When we last met, our cheater of a man, Jacob, was sent north to find a wife, apparently, but in reality, he was fleeing from his brother, who was trying to murder him because he had cheated his brother. He deceived his father, he robbed his brother, he's on the run, and while he was sleeping outside of a village in Luz, which was later renamed Bethel, Jacob had a dream in which the Lord appeared to him standing at the top of the ladder, and that's where we get this idea of Stairway to Heaven or Jacob's Ladder. The Lord appears, speaks to Jacob. He passes the torch from Abraham to Isaac and now to Jacob. Jacob woke up, he worshiped the Lord, he created this altar, and he marveled at what he had seen. And what we're going to find in the next part of the story is continuing sanctification. The Lord will continue to chisel away the character of his patriarch. And in fact, our big idea today is chiseling away the chaff that God must work to make us more like Jesus. Now, if you want to follow along, our story begins in verse 1, and the narrator gives a short summary. He says, he, Jacob, came to the land of the people of the east. Now, if we look at our map here, Jacob started actually just below the map here. He ended up here in Bethel, and the journey he made is here all the way up to here. This is where Jacob's fathers or grandfathers came from. So he made this long journey. This would have taken many months. There would have been many adventures, many stories to tell, but the narrator gives us a single line. When Jacob arrives in the country of the east, Haran, he goes to a well. And we might forget this, that the well was one of the cultural centers of that world. If you wanted information, if you wanted to know what was going on, if you wanted to figure out where to go, you went to the well or to the city gate. So there he is, doing what we would do, but differently. You see, we go to a gas station, we go to a restaurant, we go to a hotel, we get on apps and figure out what's going on, where do we want to stay. Jacob went to the well, and he went there to get news. So he encounters a group of shepherds, and he inquires, hey, have you heard of a guy by the name of Laban? And they say, oh, yeah, we know who he is. And Jacob says, is he doing well? Oh, yeah, he's great. And by the way, here comes his daughter. And we're introduced to, in verse 9, Rachel, the shepherdess. Now, before she approaches, there is an odd interaction whereby Jacob basically tells the shepherds they were doing their job wrong. You see, if you read it, you might just kind of pass this detail over, but he's a stranger in the land. He shows up, he sees them with the flocks, and he's like, you guys are doing it wrong, which we'll get into that later. By the way, on that issue, and this one is for free, one of the greatest personal skills that you can develop, and if you can learn it at 8 years old or at 80, it's going to help you immensely. One of the greatest skills that we can develop is the ability to let somebody be wrong. You see, the shepherds might have been doing it wrong, and Jacob might have been right, but he should have kept quiet. So Rachel approaches with the flocks and the herds. She is Laban's daughter, which means Jacob is her cousin. Now, I want you to notice the reversal from several chapters ago. When Isaac went back home to find a wife, Rebekah showed up, and she took the initiative and watered all of his camels. The story reverses where Jacob shows up, Rachel shows up with the flocks, he removes the stone, and then he waters her flocks and herds. I don't know if there's any relevance to that other than it is curious. Afterward, Jacob kisses her, weeps, and then informs her that he's not a rando helping her at the well, but he is indeed her kinsman. She immediately runs to go tell her father, Laban. Laban then hears the news, responds immediately. He heads to the well, he greets Jacob, and then brings him back to their home. Now notice Laban, the uncle, what he says to his nephew Jacob in verse 14. This is interesting. He says, surely you are my bone and my flesh. Now, does this remind you of anything? See, it should remind us of Genesis chapter 2. When Adam first saw Eve, he said, this at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And then 2,000 years later, Laban sees a relative and says, surely you are my bone and flesh. Now, what's the connection here? Well, it's simply, this phrase simply means we're family. You're bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. We're family. But it also indicates that the patriarchs knew their familial and religious history. That Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would have known the story of creation and Adam and Eve, and these phrases from Genesis chapter 2 carried 2,000 years into the future and became part of their slang, their vocabulary. Now, someone might argue, well, come on now. This is 2,000 years later. Is Laban really going to know what Adam said 2,000 years previously without the modern printing press? And furthermore, if this was a myth written by a single author or patched together by an editor, wouldn't this indicate that this was a phrase that the author had, and the author used it in Genesis 2 and in Genesis 29, indicating that this is indeed a myth? Well, I don't think so, because proverbial sayings have a way of sticking around for a lot longer than you would think. Now, I want you to consider the words of Billy the Kid and what he said against Sheriff Brady in the 1980s film Young Guns. Listen to what Billy the Kid says.
Reap the whirlwind, Sheriff Brady. reap it.
Now, there's a big gunshot right there, and I decided to keep that out of the clip. What's curious is that Billy the Kid here is quoting the prophet Hosea. Now, Hosea isn't known to be one of the most famous prophets, and his statements aren't particularly famous throughout the history of Christianity or even our world. And I want you to notice, too, that the Hosea was written around 725 BC. So we have 725 years until the time of Christ, then 2,000 years until the time of 1980, when some Hollywood scriptwriter was writing this script and decided to quote the book of Hosea in the movie so that Emilio Estevez could quote it and you could see it. Now, my point is that pithy sayings stick around, and then from the book of Hosea to Billy the Kid, we're talking 2,700 years, which is more time than the distance between Adam and Laban. So all that to say that pithy sayings have cultural staying power, and I believe that Laban knew the history of Adam and Eve, and he knew their heritage, and this was a saying, you are bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, that was passed down. Now, in our story, Jacob shows up, and then eventually Laban offers him a job and says, you know what can I pay you? And Jacob counters, and he says, how about instead of pay, you let me marry your youngest daughter, Rachel? Well, they agree, and then Jacob gets right to work. Lo and behold, the 7 years are complete, and the wedding night arrives. And Jacob receives his bride, and they consummate, but in the morning he discovers that it's not Rachel he slept with, but Leah. Now, I have some logistical questions about how this is possible, but the inquiry would devolve into something that is past PG-13. But all that I will say is that I think Jacob and Rachel were probably kept separate from each other. They weren't spending hours together, and they didn't know the nuance of each other's voice, their scent, and their mannerisms, and so on. The bride was probably veiled, and then he received her into his bed at nighttime. Now, as you would expect, Jacob was not happy about this. Laban's excuse was that, well, in this culture, we marry off the older one first. Now, the scripture does not describe Leah as being particularly beautiful, and it does say that she had poor eyesight. And we believe, or I think, that the father was simply trying to get her married off because once it was consummated, the deal was done and there was no going back. Now, this was, of course, deceitful, and what we find is an irony that the cheater himself is getting cheated. Now, if we step back and we look at the story, what does this communicate about poor Leah? Sorry, dear, but you were beaten with the ugly stick so badly that I had to trick some guy into marrying you. I see a therapist in her future. So they made this deal in verse 27. If you will just do one more week of work and promise to do another 7 years, then I will give you Rachel. And so Jacob took the deal. He completed his work. He took Rachel to be his wife and then worked another 7 years. Now, our tale ends with a very sad statement. And we might be tempted to blame Jacob, but this was not any of his doing. He never consented to any of this. But it says that Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. And that, my friends, is our tale. But let's look at some big picture considerations here. Remember, the author and narrator of Genesis, Moses, does not typically give us the lesson that we're supposed to learn. He doesn't really comment. He just gives us the story. And furthermore, Genesis wasn't set up with these tidy little stories where here's this story and at the very end there's a clear moral to it. No, it's difficult to extract usable life lessons from parts of the story. But with simple observations, we can recognize some themes. Now, going back to the big picture, what do we find? We find that the Lord is fulfilling his promises to Jacob. What does Jacob need? Jacob needs a godly wife. In order for the Lord to fulfill his plan that started in Genesis 12 through Genesis 18, he needs Jacob to have a godly wife, and this is opposed to his brother Esau, who had a bunch of Hittite women who caused a lot of trouble. Jacob also needed offspring for the great nation that the Lord would create, and he would go on to have 13 children, and they would become the 12 tribes, essentially. But Jacob also needed significant work on his character. I believe at this point that he's placed his faith in the Lord according to the last chapter, but he needs to be sanctified. He needs to have his character worked on. Now, if you aren't aware, God has a responsibility to mold and train us into maturity. Why? Because we are in a covenant with him. He's also adopted us as children. He has a vision of who we can and should be. And his job is to conform us into the image of his son. He's going to make us more like Jesus. And in fact, here's what Jesus himself says about this very thing. He says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit is taken away, and every branch that does not bear fruit he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. So what we find in this story is that God was pruning and disciplining Jacob into maturity so that he can bear more fruit. And this is one of the maybe more difficult things in our faith, is that when you place your faith in the Lord Jesus, one of his tasks is to mature you into bearing more fruit. And most of the time, according to James 1, that comes through trials. Let's talk first, as far as observations from the text, let's talk first about marriage. You see, remember, when it comes to the Bible, it doesn't give us an organized list of what to do with every topic under the sun. So if you say, okay, how do I raise my children? How do I start a business? You're going to find information there, but it's not all neatly packaged. You have to go out and search for it. You seek and you find, you knock, the door will be opened. And when it comes to marriage, there isn't like a section that just tells you everything you need to know. It's buried and you have to mine it out. In this passage, we find perhaps one of the most romantic passages in all of Scripture. Now, you might have thought it was from the Song of Songs or something like that. No, it's in Genesis 29. And this should be a guide for both men and women. Here's what the narrator tells us. So, Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. And this is when you say, oh. Now, this is interesting. Let's stop. Let's slow down and look at this. He worked 7 years for this girl, but in his estimation of the time seemed like a few days. Why? Because of the love that he had for her. The love that he had for her was so great that he was willing to work and to sacrifice and wait, and it seemed like not a very big deal. The sacrifice seemed so small compared to the love that I had for this woman. You will find many young people as they are growing up, there are always complications when it comes to finding a spouse. And the complications are usually things that make you have to work and wait. It might be that you're on the younger side and you graduate and one is going off into the military and the discussion is, are we both willing to wait this out? Who knows where I'll be deployed? Who knows what shape I'll be in when I come back? But are you willing to wait? And are you willing to wait? It might be that one partner in this relationship says, I'm going down south to go to college and I will see you via text, we'll do some video conferencing, we'll call, but I'm only going to see you maybe 3 or 4 times a year. Are you willing to work at this and to wait? Now, we couple this with Paul's definition, because one of the problems we have in our culture is we use this word love. It's thrown around to mean almost anything under the sun, and therefore, I hate to say it, it's kind of a useless word. But Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13:4 that love is patient. So if you're not showing patience, you're not demonstrating love. So what I would argue, young people that are not married, or middle-aged or older people that are not married, is that as you are looking for someone, the example here is that we ought to find someone who is willing both to work for us and to wait for us. That there are significant challenges, there are significant hurdles, there's a wait time that I don't like, but if you are willing to wait, it means that you actually love this person. Now, it might be that the person isn't willing to wait, and that's okay. They didn't love you. Now, I don't mean to say they didn't have feelings for you, but by the biblical definition, because love is patient, they did not love you, and that's okay. You move on. All that to say, when it comes to marriage, there is so much here, but we have to mine it out. And the big picture here is that you are looking for someone who is willing to work and to wait for you. Look for that person. Now, that's not it alone, because there's much more, but that is something to consider. And besides, don't you want to have this romantic statement represent your marriage as you move into it? You know, he loved me so much that whatever we went through seemed like nothing because of the love he had for me. Oh. Okay, we're going to move on because the primary lesson here in this passage has to do with arrogance. Jacob, we think, had an easy upbringing. He grew up with a mom, a dad, a family. He had wealth. He had prestige. And he even had servants. And these things are not intrinsically bad. But he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. He had house servants, and he was also the weaker of the two brothers. Remember that Esau was a wild outdoorsman, and Jacob, when under the threat of murder, actually ran rather than staying and fighting. So we know that he was the younger brother and that he was the weaker brother, and yet he managed, through the craftiness of his mind and the deceit in his heart, to get what he wanted. He got the birthright and the blessing from his brother, who was older and stronger. He used his craftiness to succeed. And like Icarus, he thought the rules didn't apply to him. He flew too high, and he crashed and burned, and he's still crashing and burning. You see, the last chapter demonstrates Jacob fleeing for his life because his own manipulation finally caught up with him. And we would think, oh, he's learned his lesson. He had this long journey. He encountered the Lord, and now he's doing all this stuff. The Lord is working on him, and yet we run into Genesis 29:6. He shows up to Haran. He meets a group of people that he's never met before, and look what he says to them. He says, it's still high day. It is not time for the livestock to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go pasture them. Oh, really, jerkface? So we don't know who you are. You show up out of nowhere acting like you're some big shot, and you're going to tell us how to manage our flocks and herds. You've probably met people like that before. They don't know you. They don't know the specifics of your environment, but they know how to do your job better than you do. And they make sure and tell you that much. Jacob was accustomed to being the son of the boss, and he probably had shepherds that he was able to order around in his family's camp. He arrives here in Haran, and he tries doing the same thing. Arrogance, hubris, is something that the Lord must purge from our lives. But I thought it might be helpful to come up with a definition of what that is. And so I thought about it for a while, and then I came up with my own definition. And then I thought, is it arrogant for me to come up with my own definition? I don't know. But here's what I came up with, that arrogance is an inflated sense of value, skill, authority, and position. But because I don't want to actualize the thing I'm trying to define, I looked up other definitions as well, and I was pleasantly surprised to find that I was close. Here is dictionary.com. An exaggerated self-opinion. Here is Merriam-Webster.com, an exaggerated sense of one's importance. And then here's the famous Webster's Dictionary from 1828, making or having the disposition to make exorbitant claims of rank or estimation, giving oneself an undue degree of importance. Notice that all of these have to do with inflation or exaggeration of one's self. You see, it's not arrogant to claim that you are the best if you actually are the best. In fact, in certain environments, you have to know you are the best to survive. Don't think you are, know you are. If you're going to step into a boxing ring, a UFC cage, you have got to be absolutely convinced that you are at the top of your game and you're going to beat this guy into a pulp. You have to know that walking in. You can't be like, well, I'm going to try. I'm not. No, like that doesn't work that way. I've heard it said that you can't plant a church unless you have an inflated ego. And I get what they're saying, that if you, by nature of planting a church, you're saying, I can do better than any of the other local churches around here. But guess what? Maybe you can. And if it's true, it's not arrogance. Some people actually have the final word. You might say, that's arrogant to have the final word. No, it's not. No, it's not. The Supreme Court justices have the final word. They vote, and their statement becomes the law of the land. That's not arrogance. They actually have the authority. It might be arrogant to try to detain someone, but a law enforcement officer has been given the authority, and they can actually detain you, and they have the legal and moral right to do so. So all that to say that arrogance is not having authority, using authority, or functioning at a high level of skill. It is an inflated or exaggerated sense of skill or self-importance. If the manager of the shepherds showed up and said, hey, you guys need to do this and that and the other, that would be fine. But Jacob, who is a nobody, shows up and does the same thing. That is hubris. Maybe the shepherds at the well were doing it wrong, but Jacob had neither the authority nor the position to correct them. He inflated himself in that situation. Now, it reminds me of the time when Matthew McConaughey was in the Navy and was talking with John Bon Jovi. This is a clip from a film where Matthew McConaughey is, in fact, talking to John Bon Jovi, and then they have kind of a rude encounter with another person. Check this out.
Now you're going to transfer to another boat.
Excuse me. Either one of you two tell me where I can find the exec of this thing?
Yeah, that's me, Mac. We'll have a truck unload here shortly.
Well, you unload it now. Here's a manifest. Let's get those crates below decks. Marine Major Coonan, Office of Naval Intelligence. I'm going to see with you boys. That's my luggage. You got a problem? Talk to Mr. Hirsch.
Now, you might think this guy was arrogant. Yeah, we're going to unload it. No, you'll do it now. That's my luggage. Unload it. You have a problem. Talk to somebody else. It would be arrogant if this were some random guy. But he's an officer that has authority over them, and he's establishing that authority. He has every right to do it, and he needs to establish that relationship right from the very beginning. He walks up and says, you're going to do it, and you're going to do it now. And that's totally legitimate. I would argue that this is not arrogance. This is him functioning and in war. However, if it were just some random guy saying that, then that would be arrogant. So let's talk about the root. Where does this arrogance that we have within us come from? Well, sometimes it's as simple as age. Older people can be arrogant, but it's more common with younger people. Of course, Daedalus was wise enough to fly in the middle, and it was his son, the young man Icarus, who flew up too high. And for young men in particular, we have streams of testosterone that flies through our veins, and it makes us lose several IQ points. And so younger people tend to feel invincible. Our sense of conquering the world can be inflated. But it also means that you young people in the room need to check yourself more often, because it's more often going to be a problem with you than with the older people. It could be life experience. We might grow up with very little struggle, few hardships. We always got what we wanted. And so we're just accustomed to sort of being the main character in the story. They call it the main character syndrome. Here's another big one. This is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is the last name of two psychologists in the 1990s, Dunning and Kruger, and they coined the term in 1999. It's a cognitive bias whereby people with limited knowledge or skill in a particular area tend to overestimate their own competence because they're not skilled enough to recognize that they have no skill. It's a technical way of saying you know enough to be dangerous. Now, this happens frequently in martial arts. You see, you show up, you learn this, you learn that, there's different moves, and if you do this, I'm going to do this, and all this stuff, and suddenly now you think you're Mr. Street Fighter. But Mike Tyson famously said that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And so if you are not getting punched in the face, it's not real training. All right, let me show you a graph here. All right, here on the left, we have confidence. So this is low confidence, high confidence. And then this is us knowing nothing. And then this is us being a guru. Now, what you would expect is this. You would expect that as I grow in my competence, that my confidence would go up with it. So I grow in my skill and my confidence goes with it. The Dunning-Kruger effect observes the exact opposite. Check this out. Right here, you have what's called the peak of Mount Stupid. So you learn a tiny bit and suddenly you think you know it all. So think about, again, I don't want to pick on martial artists, but I've been around that game a long time, and beginning Greek students are just as bad. But then, if you stay with it, you will realize that you don't know anything, and this is when you fall off the peak of Mount Stupid into the valley of despair. And then over time, if you keep studying, your confidence will go up. But notice that the end level of confidence is still not even as high as the people on the peak of Mount Stupid. This is a huge cause of arrogance, and the solution is to recognize your overconfidence when you learn something new. But the root cause of all arrogance is, as you would expect, the sinful heart. That ultimately, like the enemy of old, we want to be like God. We want to be God. We think we know better than God, and we think our ways are better than God's ways, and so we will do things our own way. And I suspect that this is what was happening, and many of these other things were happening within the heart of our character, Jacob. So what is the cure for this? Well, obviously, part of that is just time. The longer that we live, the more we realize that we're not invincible and that we're not the center of the world and that our main character syndrome begins to fade. But there are some things that are required for us to grow out of our arrogance, and a big one is humiliation. And I don't mean purposeful humiliation. I'm not saying we should humiliate people, but if you begin studying, eventually you're going to fall off the peak of Mount Stupid and you're going to be in the valley of despair. And that's when we can really begin to learn. Now, I see this a lot when it comes to people who are wanting to join the worship team. Now, I don't want to pick on the musicians because I'm actually picking on the pre-musicians, okay? This is the way it works. You might have a person, maybe it's a younger person, and they have a guitar, and they've been watching YouTube videos, and all they do is they're shredding at home, and like last week, they can do Stairway to Heaven. They can do all this stuff, and they're awesome, and they know they're awesome, and they think they're awesome, and they're like, I want to get on the worship team. Of course, well, what's your character like? Are you a worshiper, or are you a musician? These are big questions. But here's what happens. They get up there, and suddenly they see 105 people staring at them. The adrenaline comes up. Everything starts to change. Because you're an awesome musician when you're in your parents' basement watching YouTube videos, playing riffs and stuff. But now you have people staring at you, and that's not even the hardest part. The hardest part now is you're playing with a group of people. And most churches now have click tracks. And so you could do whatever you want on your guitar, but now you're having to play with a click track. You have to stay on time. And that is a whole other skill set. And so if you thought you were awesome, and now suddenly you're having to play in a band, then you kind of fall down into the valley of despair. And that's where a lot of people quit. Now, we hope that you wouldn't. We hope that you will learn to play with people, learn to play in front of people, and then grow up in your skill. But what often happens is that it's the humiliation that needs to occur for us to grow. We have to recognize that we aren't as good as we thought we are. Now, Jesus has something to say about this, and I think this is not only an observation, but I think it's something that the Lord does. He says that whoever exalts himself will be humbled. And this is exactly the story of Icarus. If you fly yourself way up high in the sky, you're going to crash and burn. And a natural consequence of arrogance is that we're going to be humbled. But sometimes I think that when we are climbing high upon the slopes of our own exaltation, teetering over the cliffs of the deep valley of humility, the Lord gives us a little shove. Another cure that we see in this text is the application of hardship. And this is why I believe the Lord allowed Jacob to have to flee for his life, to spend months traveling in the wilderness, and then have to have 14 years of hard labor. I want you to notice that Jacob was duped. This is a poetic justice. The deceiver was deceived. And I believe the Lord allowed this to temper his arrogance and so that he would know what it was like to be hornswoggled out of something. Now, another cure for arrogance, of course, is the discipline of the Lord. And as I said, when we become a son or a daughter of the Creator, he becomes a father to us. And his job is to discipline us and make us more like his son. In fact, here's what the writer of Hebrews says, and he's partially quoting the Old Testament. Have you forgotten the exhortation that addressed you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. And then he goes on to say, for the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Now, this is among the less happy verses in the Bible, but it demonstrates that we have a loving Father who works in us because he wants the best for us. Now, I believe that the final cure for arrogance is a healthy view of sin, the cross, and the grace and the mercy of God. Remember that our natural inborn character, our conduct was so bad that Jesus had to die a horrible death on the cross to satisfy the wrath of God that should have fallen upon us. We deserved to die. And then God, in his absolute grace and mercy, withheld the wrath that we deserved and then dispensed the grace that we don't deserve. And when we contemplate, when we truly quiet our minds and contemplate our own conduct, when we contemplate the cross of Christ, when we contemplate the mercy of God, when we contemplate the grace of God, then we will find that any kind of pride or arrogance or hubris will begin to melt away. Now, you might be thinking, wow, this is kind of a tough passage here. Well, the good news in this story is that we are not left alone. We were not adopted by the Lord and then treated as an orphan and just thrown into a room and said, hey, do whatever you want to do. No, the Lord says, you are my work of art. I am the potter and you are the clay. I'm going to develop you because I know who you can be. I know your spiritual gifts. I know your talents. I know your passions. When I can chisel away this garbage and then underneath that is something that I can use for the glory of God and the propagation of the gospel, it's there that I want you. And so the Lord does not leave us alone. He changes us, shapes us, and molds us into the likeness of his Son. And this is the good news, that he is making you into who he wants you to be, but there are some hardships we face with that. We see it in the life of Jacob, and you probably see it in yourself.